Hello, everyone, and welcome to Chapter 2, Beginnings of English America. These are some of the topics we're going to be talking about in Chapter 2, England and the New World, Coming of the English, Settling the Chesapeake, New England Way, Division amongst the New Englanders, and religion, politics, and freedom. Starting off, we're going to take a look at this portrait of Queen Elizabeth I by George Gower. This painting was done to commemorate the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, but we also see some links in this picture to colonization of the New World. You can see the Navy through the window, the Queen's hand is on the globe, and it appears as though her fingers are pointing to the coast of North America in this picture. Remember, with our focus questions on this section of the lecture, the notes you should be taking, any details, anything that's going to help you come back to this question. So in this first part, we're looking at what were the main contours of English colonization in the 17th century. What were the main parts or the main details? In the 16th century, England was a second-rate power in Europe, meaning they were no longer the strongest country in the world. They had been weakened by internal divisions, especially between the Catholics and the Protestants, when King Henry VIII had launched the Protestant Reformation in England with a split from the Catholic Church to the Church of England, or sometimes we call that the Anglican Church. Queen Elizabeth I, who ruled from 1558 to 1603, had finally secured the power of that Anglican Church and defended England from its Catholic enemies on the continent, notably the Spanish, who in 1588 had attempted to invade by massive armada, but they were defeated. Going back again to the photo or the painting at the beginning. Well into the 1600s, the English had also attempted to subdue Ireland and its Catholic population, in part through military conquest and colonization. The English had also expelled Irish Catholics from land to make room for Protestant settlements called plantations. These practices and ideas that defined England's colonization of Ireland also helped to influence the same kind of ideals and practices that we would see them continue to practice in North America. This is a picture of Mary Tudor, picture, not the appropriate term. This is the queen who tried to restore Catholicism in England. This was painted in 1554 by Antonio Moro. He had done lots of portraits of European royalty. You can see in this picture he's really showing her as a woman of firm determination. She does look very masculine, possibly, in this picture, which would be done in a sense to try to give her those characteristics of being strong and firm in her resolve. Only under Queen Elizabeth's reign did the English look to North America. So it was after Mary Tudor and under Queen Elizabeth. Although they were, at first, were really more interested in raiding Spanish cities and the treasure fleets than they were in colonization, the first two colonies in Newfoundland and what would later become North Carolina were very small efforts that very quickly failed. However, like the Spanish, the ideas of national glory and profit and even religious mission helped to define the English interest in the New World. The Reformation, Protestants, England's increasing rivalry and enmity toward the Catholic Spanish Empire helped to the English to see their presence in North America as a way to liberate the New World and its Indians from the evil and the tyranny that was the Spanish Catholic Empire. So England is seeing opportunities within the New World to not only continue to dominate the Spanish, but to also free those inhabitants that have been there from Spanish influence. Other advocates of colonization argued that North America would also absorb England's surplus population. England was in a period of economic crisis, lots of population growth. They're running out of room. And so colonization would be a way to send the poor, the peasants, those who'd been evicted from their own lands and the commons by the wealthy landlord, and who seemed to English elites that might threaten their social order and stability. So this was seen as a place to kind of get rid of some of basically the poor and the undesirable. Under Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, the unemployed could have been whipped, branded, hanged, or even forced to labor. Voluntary or involuntary emigration to the New World was really seen as an alternative that would benefit the poor and the English nation. In turn, images of America, such as that appeared in Thomas More's Utopia, promoted the New World as a place of wealth and opportunity, where men could escape some of the hierarchy and inequality of Europe, get economic independence through owning land, and would be able to rule themselves. And these images appealed to ordinary Englishmen and encouraged them to risk, the migration and the very long trip to the New World. This is an engraving by Theodore de Bry. Shows the colonists hunting and fishing in Virginia. This was kind of a promotional image. This would have been published in England to try to encourage more people to come to the New World. So you can see this image really emphasizes the abundance of the New World. They could live familiar lives. It doesn't look too foreign or too different than what they already have in England at the time. This is William Hogarth's well-known engraving Gin Lane. This is kind of meant to be a little more satirical in looking at lower-class life in London. This is in 1751, so we're a little bit further ahead. He's really looking at, in this picture, the abuse of alcohol that seemed prevalent amongst the poor in England at the time. You see the woman letting the baby fall out of her arms, while a man on the left, a man and his wife are, selling their coats, their tools, anything they can for money, for liquor. This is really just kind of a commentary on what those in the upper class might have felt that the poor were living a lifestyle of. So in this next section, we're looking at the obstacles the English settlers in Chesapeake had to overcome. Immigration was risky. There were diseases, internal religious, political, economic tensions, and there were wars and conflicts with the Indians that all threatened to harm the English immigrants, or really just even death. Dependent on England for protection and economic aid, most of the settlements would have collapsed without support from the English Empire and further immigration. Because economic conditions in England were so bad, more migrants in the 17th century, about 500,000, had left England than France or Spain. So more English are coming than anybody else. Most of the English who came to North America were young, single men from lower ranks of English society, and they settled in tobacco-producing colonies of Virginia and Maryland. There was a high labor demand and in those areas as well, and the rest settled in New England in the middle colonies of New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. Settlers who could afford their own passage arrived as free persons and soon acquired land. In the 1600s, however, most Englishmen arrived as indentured servants, which means they voluntarily surrendered their freedom for a period of time. Usually this was about 5 to 7 years, and this was done in exchange for passage to America. Servants were as unfree as slaves in many ways. They could be bought, sold, could not marry without permission from the person who had bought their passage, their owner. They were subject to physical punishment, and they weren't allowed to not work. However, unlike slaves, these indentured servants, at least the ones that made it through their 5 to 7 years, eventually became free and received freedom dues, which sometimes included land. So this would be kind of, you think of that as almost like a gift or a payment at the end of their time that they've served. Obviously not for the payment of their times worked, but just kind of like a little gift at the end. Land for the English was the basis of liberty. Okay, men who could control their own labor, and in most of the colonies, it was the landowners that were allowed to vote. The English crown, so the English monarchy, had also awarded land grants. Sometimes these were quite extensive, to their relatives and allies. Because land was so plentiful in North America and so many English migrants, both free and servant, came to America to gain land and the independence that came with it, property owners soon turned to African slaves as their labor force. Liberty and slavery moved together in early English America. So we have liberty with the freedom granted to those who could own land, at the same time that we see the growth of slavery because we need people to work the land. You can see here, this is a pamphlet that was published in 1609, also promoting immigration to Virginia. This is an indenture, a contract for labor. So remember, we were talking about the indentured servants that would work for 5 to 7 years. This is the contract that would have been signed. This one was signed by James Mahoney. He was an Irish immigrant who emigrated to North America in 1723. Unlike the Spanish, English colonists did not necessarily want to rule or assimilate the Indians they found. They just wanted their land. Although the English colonial authorities insisted that the Indians had no real claim to the land because they did not farm it or improve it, most authorities in practice did recognize the Indians' title to land based on their occupancy. So basically, you have authorities saying, on one side, it's not the Indians' land because they're not doing anything to farm it, to improve it. However, it is sort of their land because they occupy it. English colonists had acquired Indian land by purchase, often through treaties that were forced on the natives after they had defeated them in recurrent warfare that was prevalent in the English colonies. And this is a process that really displaced the Indians from their original territories. Though many of the eastern Indians initially had welcomed English settlers, particularly for the goods that they had introduced into their native culture, like cloth, metal tools, and guns, many of the Indians soon gradually came to resent the changes that English colonization had brought to their life. Men turned more to hunting, beaver, and fur trading. Older skills fell into disuse with the appearance of English technologies. Alcohol also becomes very common and disruptive amongst the natives. As the colonists developed a military advantage over the Indians, profits from the fur trade flowed mostly to the colonial and European merchants. English colonists also introduced diseases that had led to devastating epidemics. English settlement transformed the land and its uses, threatening the Indians' way of life through fencing, new crops, livestock like pigs and cattle, which trampled Indian crops, and the depletion of forests to supply wood for the English domestic market. You can see here, this is really the only known contemporary portrait of a New England Indian. This is 1681 painting by an unnamed artist. This was thought to represent the leader of a Rhode Island tribe. However, most recently it's been identified as David, the Indian who saved the life of John Winthrop, the colonial governor of Connecticut. You'll notice on there, apart from the beads around his neck, everything that he's wearing is of English manufacture. The boots, the cloth, the kind of shawl cape thing. Okay. Now, for this next section, we're looking at Virginia and Maryland and how they developed early on, what the development was like in their early years. The Jamestown colony was the first permanent English settlement in the New World. This was founded in 1607 by the private Virginia Company. At first, this colony was intended as a means to discover gold and other precious materials. However, there was a lot of problems internally. There was a high death rate. There were very few supplies from England. And the colonists, who had really just come with hopes of quick riches, had very little experience with agriculture, which led to starvation, when compounded with disease and illness led to this higher death rate. Few of the settlers survived the first year, and only military discipline imposed by former soldier John Smith saved the colony. To become more viable and to attract more settlers, the Virginia Company stopped looking for gold and started to grow its own food in a marketable commodity and created an elected representative assembly. The company awarded land to those who paid their own or others' passage and issued a charter of grants and liberties, which included a House of Burgesses, which was our first elected assembly in colonial America, even though only landowners could vote. And the arrival in 1619 of the first 20 blacks in Virginia marked, along with the meeting of the House of Burgesses that year, the conjoined development of freedom and slavery in North America. Again, we're going back to this idea of the simultaneous growth of freedom for some people and slavery for others at the same time. This map right here is the English settlement of the Chesapeake. You can see that the settlement had spread well beyond the initial colony of Jamestown, and a lot of this was as tobacco planters were looking for more fertile land near the waterways that they could navigate. This is a picture of John Smith, the leader of the Virginia colony. This was engraved on a 1624 map of New England. Native Americans ruled by Powhatan, or Powhatan, you can hear it pronounced multiple ways, had lived in the area of Virginia that had been colonized by the Jamestown settlers. First, the English that were very dependent upon the Indians for food. They tried to maintain friendly relations with the Indians. When John Smith was captured by the Indians, Powhatan's daughter Pocahontas, probably really just playing out her role in a very elaborate ceremony, intervened to save Smith's life from execution, and Pocahontas very quickly, or very gradually, became an intermediary between the Jamestown colony and Powhatan's people. So this is where we get our legend of Pocahontas saving John Smith's life. No, she did not marry him. She married John Rolfe, another English settler, came to England, became very famous. We also see fighting kind of happening sporadically, not continuously, but occasional fighting that is going to happen between the Indians and the Jamestown colonists until about 1614. Peace was declared that year, but it was broken in 1622 by Powhatan's successor, whose surprise attack nearly wiped out 25% of Virginia's small settler population. Jamestown survivors retaliated by massacring scores of Indians and destroying their villages. The English now held the balance of power in the colony and Virginia, which soon became the first royal colony of England. They began to stabilize and slowly increase their population, in part by turning to the cultivation of tobacco. Here's our portrait of Pocahontas. This is a portrait that began to circulate in England after Pocahontas had converted to Christianity and took the name Rebecca. She became very, very famous in England after this. This is a picture of Powhatan. He was the most prominent Indian leader in the original area of the English settlement in Virginia. This shows him in his court. It was engraved on John Smith's map of Virginia, which was included in his General History of Virginia that was published in 1624. This is Theodore de Bry's engraving of the 1622 Indian uprising by Powhatan's successor. This shows the Indians massacring defenseless colonists. They're shown in this picture as being unarmed, even though we know that many of them, in fact, did own guns. Now, Virginia was a tobacco colony. More Europeans are smoking tobacco, and the crop becomes a very lucrative basis for the Virginia's colony's survival and growth. Soon, plantation elite with large estates emerged that were going to rule Virginia society and politics, and they turned from unreliable and temporary white servant labor to black slave labor. Virginia's white society came to resemble that of England, with a landed gentry at top and small farmers in the middle, and an army of the poor laborers, indentured servants, former servants without land at the bottom. Given the demand for male servant labor in the tobacco fields, men at first vastly outnumbered women in the colony. Various factors contributed to late marriage, a low rate of family formation, and although women in Virginia, as in England, had few legal rights, conditions in the colonies often gave women roles that they could not assume in England, in their mother country. Widows and unmarried women embraced their right to conduct business, make contracts, and even sometimes administer estates, something they would not have been able to do in England. Most white women arrived in Virginia as indentured servants, however, and often were subject to very hard labor and even abuse from their masters. This is an ad by Sir Walter Raleigh. This is an ad for tobacco. This includes images of slaves with agricultural implements, so farm equipment that you can see there. This is showing the pressing of tobacco, very labor intensive, just as it was caring for the plants in the field. You see the slaves and female indentured servants working with the crop after it has been harvested. Maryland, like Virginia, was also a tobacco colony. However, it was established later in 1632 by King Charles I as a proprietary colony of Cecilius Calvert. Calvert ruled Maryland much like feudal England, controlled its trade and the decisions of the elected assembly, even though the charter guarantees giving ordinary Maryland colonists all the rights and privileges of England. Calvert was a Catholic. He also saw Maryland as a refuge for other fellow persecuted Catholics in England. At first he hoped Catholics and Protestants could live there in harmony. However, Protestants, which made up the bulk of indentured servants or former servants, soon were outnumbering the Catholics, and their frustration mounted as they faced diminished opportunities for land ownership in the latter half of the 17th century. In our next section, thinking about what made the English settlement of New England distinctive. So what was distinct about New England way? In Virginia and Maryland, we see them quickly becoming societies that were dominated by a small aristocracy ruling over many people who were bound either through slavery or indentured servitude to the labor. New England, however, was a colonial society that evolved very differently. Early New England was decisively shaped by the Puritans, a diverse group of English Protestants united in their belief that the Anglican Church had too many of the practices and doctrines of the old Catholic Church. They were mainly Congregationalists who rejected Catholic structures of religious authority that had been retained in the Anglican Church. We're talking about archbishops, bishops, priests, and instead the Puritans embraced independent local congregations that chose their own clergy, determined their own mode of worship, and often listened to sermons and personally studied the Bible. Like many English and Anglicans, however, Puritans shared a hatred of Catholicism and celebrated England's greatness and devotion to liberty. They were followers of John Calvin's theology, and the Puritans believed that God had predestined different groups of people, the elect, to be saved from damnation, and no amount of good deeds or good works could save those that were not among the elect. When a minority of Puritans in England separated from the Church of England, some of the Puritans decided to emigrate to America in order to fully practice their Protestant faith away from the influence and control of the Anglican Church and the English government. John Winthrop was a leader of such immigrants that settled in the Massachusetts Bay. He really hoped to found what he called a city set upon a hill. This is where Puritans would reject their natural liberty or action without restraint. He believed that typically were practiced by the Irish and Indians and other bad Christians for more of a moral liberty to do only which is good, in which Puritans became free by accepting severe restraints on speech, religion, and personal behavior. So basically what he's saying is that by practicing a very strict set of rules within your religious moral liberty, that will be what will truly set you free. Here we have a picture of the very first book that was printed in the English mainland colonies. This is the whole book of Psalms, faithfully translated into English meter. This was published in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1640. Worshippers used it to sing psalms, religious songs from the Bible that were sung in Massachusetts unaccompanied by music, which Puritan churches had banned, not the singing songs, just the music itself. Here we have a picture of John Winthrop. He was the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. This picture was painted in the 1640s. The first Puritan settlers to America, the Pilgrims, had left the Netherlands in 1620. They were financed by private investors who were interested in establishing a trading base in North America. The Pilgrims wanted to settle in Virginia, but their ship, the Mayflower, was blown off course and landed on Cape Cod. Before the survivors of the journey established the Plymouth colony there, they drew up the Mayflower Compact, in which all adult male colonists agreed to obey just and equal laws enacted by representatives of their own choosing. This was the first written frame of government in what became the United States. So we see in the Mayflower Compact there is a degree of needing the consent of all of the members of the colony in order to work. The government did not restrict voting to just church members. All land was held common by everyone until it was divided up in 1627. In 1691, this colony became the official crown colony of England. Although earlier visits by Europeans had brought diseases that devastated the local Indian population, local Indians helped the Puritans at Plymouth survive their first winter by offering them food, and a relationship that we now celebrate as the first Thanksgiving in 1621. Chartered in 1629, the Massachusetts Bay Company was formed by London merchants hoping to further the Puritan cause by profit and trade with the Indians, and that year sent emigrants who settled in Massachusetts Bay north of Plymouth. By 1642, a great migration of about 21,000 Puritans had flowed to Massachusetts Bay through migration to New England soon thereafter, or those migration to New England soon thereafter ceased altogether. Compared to the colonists in the Chesapeake, settlers in New England were older, more prosperous, more religious. Fewer New England colonists were servants, and here women were just as numerous as men, which led to more families than in the southern colony. This is an early 17th century engraving that shows the English explorer Bartholomew Gosnold. He's encountering Native Americans. He had landed on Cape Cod in 1602 and then established a small outpost on a nearby Cuttyhunk Island. The region's Indians had much more experience with Europeans before the Pilgrims had settled there. So you can see that just depicted a bit in their interactions with one another. This is Samuel de Champlain's 1605 sketch of the Plymouth Harbor. This was made when he was exploring the coast of modern-day New England in search of a site for French settlement. This shows the area dotted with wigwams and fields of corn, squash, and beans. By the time the Pilgrims had arrived in 1620, epidemics had destroyed this thriving Indian community. This is the seal of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. You can see that the Indian not wearing clothing itself really suggests the attitude that the colonists had about the Indians being very uncivilized, the statement, "Come over and help us," illustrates their conviction that they were in fact liberating the native population rather than exploiting them as other empires had. Now, still looking at the New England way, families in New England and the patriarchal authority of the Puritan husband and father defined colonial society. So we see a focus on family, we see a focus on the father and the male as the head of the household. Adult men control the labor of women and children in farming society without large numbers of slaves or indentured servants. The women were held to be spiritual equals to men and could become full members of the church. They legally were below men in the home and in society. The average New England woman married young, gave birth 7 times, and spent most of her life as a mother, having and raising children. Puritans had a big fear of excessive individualism and social disorder. So they organized themselves in small, compact, self-governing towns that were centered on a congregational church and eventually a school. And most of the education was focused on helping those citizens within their society be able to read the Bible. They were surrounded by small house and farming lots for individual families. The colony's government reflected this religious and social division. The Massachusetts Bay Company's shareholders transformed their commercial charter into a government document, first choosing the colony's rulers, then in 1604, deputies elected by freemen, landowning church members, constituted their single legislature, the General Court. 10 years later, company officers and elected deputies were divided into 2 legislative houses. Unlike Virginia or Maryland, freemen were able to elect their governor in the Massachusetts colony. This idea of consent was central to Puritan life, including church and the state, but Puritan democracy, especially voting in colony-wide elections, was limited to those who were members of the church. This becomes a smaller number as the colony grows over time. This is a picture of the Savage family, 1779, painted by the New England artist Edward Savage. Shows several generations of a typically large Puritan family. This is an embroidered banner that depicted the main building at Harvard. This is their first college established by the English colonies. It was probably made by a Massachusetts woman for her son or husband who had attended the university. Next section, New Englanders divided. We're going to be looking at the main sources of discord or disagreements in early New England. Although New England's Puritans had respected individual judgment, they did not appreciate individualism and considered too much emphasis on the self as dangerous to social harmony and stability. In the region's compact towns, residents monitored each other and punished or ostracized those who violated any community norms. Dissenters were not so much free to dissent as they were free to leave the Puritan community if they transgressed Puritan social and religious norms. So it wasn't that you were free to have a disagreement. You could sure disagree, but you were expected to leave if you did. Roger Williams was one of such dissenter who suggested that Massachusetts Bay should separate church and state. He argued that the congregation should withdraw from the Anglican Church and also reject the conviction that Puritans were an elect people with divine mission to spread true Protestant faith. He was banished from the colony. Williams and his followers then founded Rhode Island, which became a beacon of religious freedom. There was no established church, no religious qualifications for voting. Other religious dissenters went on to found the colonies of Hartford and New Haven, which became the colony of Connecticut in 1662. The Puritan establishment found one dissenter, Anne Hutchinson, to be very particularly threatening because, number one, she was a woman, and because she had a very strong influence over all other colonists. She argued that inner grace, not just church attendance and moral behavior, determined who could be a member of the saved Puritan elect. Denounced by the church and state authorities, For putting her own judgment or faith above the law and the church's teachings, Hutcheson was put on trial and banished from the colony. You see here in this map of English settlement in New England. This is about 1640. English settlement in New England is spreading well inland and also up and down the Atlantic coast. This is Roger Williams. Remember, he was a pioneer of the idea of religious toleration in the colony. He had left Massachusetts, found Rhode Island, where he established a separation of church and state. He really believed that his views had really been misunderstood by some of the other settlers of Providence. So in your textbook on page 79, you can read a letter that he wrote to kind of explain his own understanding of freedom, how far freedom could spread, its limits, and that would be something very good to read. Page 79. The Puritans, back to the Puritans, and who had recognized the Indians' claim to land and sought to acquire it through purchase, also tended to see the Indians as savages, heathens, view them very similar in the way that they viewed Catholics in their deceptive rituals and worship of false gods. They were afraid that undisciplined Indian life would attract some colonists. So Puritan New Englanders hoped to prevent their fellow Englishmen from joining native tribes by passing laws and publishing narratives of captivity, promoting the Christian life in the colony. So basically, they passed laws that would prohibit the colonists from taking on any characteristics or joining the tribes, and they would publish these stories about how the Indians would capture them, torture them, in order to prevent them from wanting to be part of that native life. Although the Puritans advocated the conversion of Indians to Christianity, they really initially had very few efforts made in order to do that. As the white population of New England had increased, also did the tensions with the Indians. In 1637, colonists responded to the murder of a fur trader by a few members of the Pequots, a powerful tribe in southern New England that controlled fur trade, by destroying the Pequot village in Mystic, Connecticut. They massacred more than 500 men, women, and children, and the Pequots' defeat led to further white settlement in western New England and intimidated local Indians for about 40 years to keep them at bay, if you will. Here we can see the title page of a translation of the Bible into the Massachusetts language. This is published by John Eliot in 1663. So this is one attempt to get the word to the natives by the Puritans. This is an engraving from John Underhill's News from America that was published in London in 1638, showing the destruction of the Pequot village at Mystic River, 1637, the year before. You can see the colonial forces firing guns are aided by their Indian allies with bows and arrows. They're defeating the Pequots. Although Puritan leaders had celebrated religion as their primary motive for emigrating to America, profit and prosperity were always central to many of their decisions to go to New England. Many of them were well off in England, but lived in economically depressed areas, so they were looking for opportunity in the New World, especially in the form of land ownership or craft. Many New Englanders made a living by exporting fish and timber to Europe, and most survived on subsistence family farming, meaning they farmed enough to help their families thrive. They were not making their money from their farming, and had very small surpluses, but very little left over. This was different in compared to southern colonies, where there were many slaves, many indentured servants. In New England, there were not very many slaves or very many indentured servants. Although New Englanders were not as wealthy as the colonies in the Chesapeake region, wealth was distributed more equally than in Virginia or Maryland. Economic development was accompanied by social inequality, with a growing number of wage earners and merchant elite profiting from an expensive trade in goods between the West Indies, Europe, and Africa. This economic growth and increasing commercialization worried some Puritan leaders. Fewer members of the Massachusetts colony were being able to be eligible for church membership, So they passed the Halfway Covenant of 1662. This was designed to solve the problem by enabling third-generation Puritans, those least likely to have met the conversion standard of the church membership, to become church members merely because they were descendants of original Puritan settlers. By the late 17th century, ministers were I'm trying to think of a good word here, guys. Exercising colonists for violations such as selfishness, pride, and violation of Sabbath in lengthy sermons called germans. So they were really just taking them to town on that. They just hammering them over and over again on those issues: selfishness, pride, violation of the Sabbath. This is a self-portrait by Thomas Smith. He was a sailor who came to New England from Bermuda around 1650. He'd acquired considerable wealth. You can see this in his fashionable clothing. The background shows a naval battle involving the Dutch and English ships. Probably is referencing their joint attack on the North African port in 1670. In the foreground is a poem with Smith's initials. This is really the earliest known American self-portrait. This is Miss Elizabeth Freak and Baby Mary. This was painted by an anonymous artist in the 1670s, and it shows the wife and daughter of John Freak, a prominent Boston merchant and lawyer. To show his family's wealth, Mrs. Freak is wearing 3 strands of pearls, a garnet bracelet, and a gold ring, and her child is wearing a yellow silk dress. Now, in this last section, we're going to be looking at religion, politics, and freedom, and looking at how the English Civil War affected the colonies in America. By 1600, the traditional view of English liberties, such as a set of privileges, and these were the set of privileges that were limited to certain social groups, was competing with the notion that certain rights of Englishmen applied to everyone in the kingdom. This tradition rested on the Magna Carta of 1215. The Magna Carta, which the king had given rights to all free men in England, also included protection against arbitrary imprisonment and the seizure of property without due process of law. Over time, this document came to signify a particularly English freedom, where the king was subject to the rule of law, meaning he was not above the law, and everybody enjoyed the security of their life and their property, which was embodied in common law rights like habeas corpus, meaning you had to be present for charges brought against you, trial by jury. As serfdom characteristics of feudalism had receded, more and more Englishmen were considered freeborn and entitled to these rights. You can see the Court of Common Pleas. In this, really celebrating the trial by jury, this is a central element to the definition of English liberty. This was a watercolor painting that was appeared in a series in London between 1808 and 1810. Now, political and religious divisions within 17th century England had heightened the meaning and the importance of freedom there and in the colonies. The struggle for political supremacy between Parliament and the Stuart monarchs, James I and Charles I, had really come to head in the 1640s in the English Civil War. They were arguing over how and to what degree the Church of England should distance itself from Catholicism. There were struggles over the respective powers of Parliament and the King, including the King's power to impose taxes without Parliament's consent. This had provoked a military conflict that ended in a victory for the Parliament forces and the abolishment of the monarchy and the execution of King Charles I. The victors established the Commonwealth and Free State that was ruled by Oliver Cromwell that lasted almost 10 years. In 1660, the monarchy was restored and Charles II assumed the throne. Political strife, political upheaval in England during these years had produced a debate about liberty that had expanded the boundaries and the definitions of freedom. The writer John Milton called for freedom of speech and the press, a movement called the Levellers proposed a written constitution abolishing both the monarchy and the House of Lords and extending the rights of freedom to those without much property. A more radical group, the Diggers, advocated the common ownership of land, and though the Levellers and the Diggers were quickly suppressed, some of their ideas were carried to America by English immigrants. Out of those struggles, English liberty, defining freedom as grounded in the common rights of all individuals in the English realm, became central to Anglo-American political culture. So the English proudly distinguished their country where individual rights and Parliament limited the king's power and authority from autocratic monarchies like we were seeing in Spain and France and Russia. So England is seeing the fact that they are moving toward individual freedom, less power in the monarchy is something that is distinguishing them and keeping them separate, and even above those countries like Spain, France, and Russia. We see here in this painting the execution of Charles I in 1649. This was a central event of the English Civil War. This is a portrait by John Aubrey, shows John Milton, the philosopher of liberty, when he attended Cambridge University. Now, while most New Englanders sided with the Parliament in the 1640s, many Puritan leaders in the colonies were a little bit leery of the revolutionaries and the Commonwealth's tolerance for religious dissent. So when followers of Anne Hutchinson became Quakers, a radical, spiritual, egalitarian Protestant sect in England that defined Puritan doctrine, Massachusetts leaders tried to suppress them by banishment, whipping, and hanging. During the English Civil War, Virginia sided with Charles I and fell under Cromwell's control. In Maryland, the Civil War exacerbated conflict that had already existed there between Catholic and Protestant settlers, and anti-propriety sentiment fed a civil war within that colony. Calvert stabilized Maryland and attracted more settlers by empowering Protestants in the colony's government and guaranteeing religious toleration for all Christians. Under Cromwell and the Commonwealth, England adopted aggressive policies to expand its colonies, to promote Protestantism, and to empower commerce or business in the British Isles and in the New World. Cromwell's army extended English control in Ireland, in the process massacring civilians, banning Catholicism, and seizing Catholic lands. England also seized the valuable sugar island of Jamaica and passed the Navigation Act in 1651, which intended to challenge the commercial supremacy of the Dutch by limiting England's colonial trade to English ships and ports. Here we have a picture of the meeting of General Council of the Army at Putney. This is a scene of debate in 1647 over the ideas of liberty and democracy between the Levellers and a more conservative army of officers. And here we have our portrait of Oliver Cromwell. Remember, ruled England after the execution of Charles I. This painting was done by Sir Peter Lely. And that is the end of chapter 2.